Jane McCall and the Twilight Stacks. Chapter 5. The Cave. They ate dinner under an air of tension. Jane focused on her sweet and sour chicken and did her best to ignore it. Her parents asked her about her day and told her about theirs, filling the air with small talk. Jane let it go in one ear and out the other. They were building up to a really big piece of bad news. On one hand, it'd be better if they'd just give it to her straight. On the other, this was the first time in months she'd eaten a meal this indulgent, and bad news had a tendency to kill her appetite. She was working her way through her second helping of fried rice when her mom broached the topic that had been hanging over her and Dad like a verbal sword of Damocles. Jane? They've set a date for Caroline's trial. She went hot, cold, hot, frozen place, swallowed hard. When? A month from now. Isn't that fast? She pressed a hand to the scar on her stomach. Not really, she shook her head. Felony cases have to be ready for trial within 6 months. Next month will be 4.5, and the case isn't complicated. It would have gone to court sooner, if not for the whole... She gestured at the right side of her face. Jane knew what she meant and why she didn't want to verbalize it. No parent enjoyed talking about the fact that their child had permanently disfigured a relative, even if it had been in self-defense. Right. Jane's appetite was gone. She pushed away from the table. May I please be excused? I have a headache. Jane, yes, you may, her father said over her mom's warning tone. We'll talk more about this when you're feeling better. Yeah, right. No way. Jane gathered her plate and made a point not to run from the table, but she moved with alacrity. A piece of chicken went to Jess's bowl, Jane's plate went to the sink, and she went to her room. She shut the door behind herself and leaned against it. Even that took too much effort, and she slid down the door until her rear met the carpet. She buried her face in her knees and tried not to cry. Nobody knew why Caroline McCall had decided to drug her niece, pop the girl's foot out of its socket, and stab her in the gut. Nobody could figure out the location where the stabbing had taken place, either. Jane and Caroline were the only ones who knew, and Caroline wasn't talking. Jane had tried to explain, but everyone had brushed her off. She'd been drugged to the gills, after all. It had been a miracle she'd been cognizant enough to get away. Confusion was natural. Baloney. Jane knew full well where Caroline had hidden the crime scene. She just didn't know how she'd done it. Caroline had stabbed Jane on an altar in a cave behind the former's house. They'd been in the middle of a family reunion. The cave was a well-known system, but Jane had never been inside. People had gone spelunking in there and died. Jane's parents had impressed upon her the dangers of being underground, and Jane had taken those warnings to heart. Caroline had coaxed her in, with promises of a reward and praise for her bravery. Jane had been so naive. She'd let herself be led in despite her better judgment. Caroline had met her with a smile that, in hindsight, was more predatory than proud. She gestured around the cave and asked Jane what she saw. Rock, mostly. A tunnel that extended back a few yards, then sloped down and narrowed until Jane would have had to army crawl to get through it. The only other notable feature was a crack in the wall too narrow for anything wider than a cat to slip in. Jane's eyes caught on it. Deep in the shadows was a light, a candle flame. Caroline knew the instant Jane saw. She'd curled an arm around Jane's shoulders and led her towards the crack. Jane had balked, but Caroline had leaned in and whispered, Do you want to see a magic trick? Jane had never been able to let go of her somewhat childish belief that magic existed. The alarm bells ringing in her head weren't enough to drown out her insistent curiosity. She'd nodded. Caroline had reached out, and the crack had widened in a warping of space Jane's senses hadn't been able to integrate. At the end, the crack had become a passage wide enough for one person to walk through. Caroline had taken hold of Jane's shoulders and pushed her in. A more claustrophobic teenager would have screamed and bailed. The enclosed space wasn't too bad for Jane. Instead, a sense of anticipation, a predator sensing prey, sensing her, had overcome her as soon as she'd crossed the threshold. She'd tried to turn around, but Caroline's grip on her shoulders tightened. Jane had been forced to stay straight and walk into the chamber. Rock walls, again, these carved and painted with symbols and figures which revolted Jane. They appeared to dance grotesquely in the light of not one but dozens of homemade candles. The candles had filled the room with smoke, and Jane had felt woozy as soon as she took a breath. The dizziness hadn't been enough to keep her from noticing the altar, though. The altar had a place of honor in the center of the room. It was the size of a twin bed, carved with the same symbols as the walls, and stained dark. A red-bladed dagger was on a black plate by one end. Jane looked at Caroline for an explanation, and she'd smiled and smiled as she'd picked Jane up and sat her on the altar. It was at that point Jane had finally gained enough awareness of the red flags to resist. Everything had been so blurry. Her body was trying to convince her to rest, but the altar was bad news. She said she wanted to leave. Caroline hadn't liked that. She'd been gentle at first, cooing and trying to pacify her target with gentle touches. Jane had kept insisting. When words had failed, she'd started to fight. She hadn't stood a chance. Caroline was sober and a full-grown woman. Jane was 13 and drugged. One good shove had sent Jane flat on her back, still flailing. A lucky swipe had caught Caroline in the throat. She'd staggered back, coughing. Jane had won enough space to stand up and stagger a few steps. She'd almost made it out of the crack when Caroline had pushed her to the ground and grabbed her by the ankle. There'd been a pop and fire under her skin. She'd screamed. Caroline had thrown her back where she'd been. She'd pinned Jane with a hand on her throat and drawn up her shirt. She'd grabbed the knife and raised it. Jane had seen the glint of metal as a shine through the fuzz. She'd gone on autopilot then. No time to think. She'd groped blindly for anything she could use. Her fingers had wrapped around a candle. Instinct had her swinging it into Caroline's face before she realized what she held. She'd been too slow. The knife had sunk into her intestines, but the candle reached its target. Hot wax splattered into Caroline's eye, and the flames sank into her cheek. She let go of the knife handle to claw at her face. Pain, blinding pain, worse than any stomachache Jane had ever had. Moving made it worse. She didn't want to move. If she didn't move, she would die. Adrenaline poured into her blood, just enough to resist the smoke. Jane had rolled off the altar and landed hard on her back. She'd crawled out around Caroline's legs, gotten kicked in the side, dragged herself through the crack, dropped the candle, kept a hand on the dagger, pull it out and you'll bleed to death, stumbled screaming out of the cave. There was a confusion of yelling and hands and lights, and she'd blacked out. She'd woken up in the hospital with a tube down her throat and her parents holding her hands. She'd panicked, been sedated. The tube had been gone the second time she woke up, but her parents were still there. They'd explained, gently, sugarcoating the whole way, about how Cousin Dane was a paramedic and had stabilized the knife. He'd staunched the bleeding all the way to the hospital. Once there, she'd been stitched up, reset, and detoxed. There'd been some nasty drugs in her system, though her parents neglected to explain the specifics. She'd been asleep for 2 days and gotten very lucky. The dagger had only nicked her small intestine, and the antibiotic regimen she was on should be sufficient to keep infections suppressed. She could leave as soon as the doctors did an evaluation to make sure her brain was mostly intact. They'd refused to tell her about Caroline. She'd pushed, but they hadn't budged. Jane had found out after leaving the hospital that she was being kept in a secure ward and had lost the use of one eye. The injury had been so bad that the trial had been delayed. Jane had been sick to her stomach when she'd found out. Nobody had been able to find the altar. For them, the crack had dead-ended 2 feet in. It didn't matter too much. One of the little cousins removed had seen Caroline lead Jane into the woods, and her fingerprints were on the knife. Candles like the one found in the cave had been discovered in Caroline's house. Jane's testimony had been considered compromised by the drugged smoke. The news of a date shouldn't have upset her as much as it had. She'd already faced scrutiny for Caroline's injury and an interrogation by 3 different officers. A jury and lawyers shouldn't be any worse, but the anticipation made her nauseous. What if they didn't believe her because the crime scene was nowhere to be found? She stressed about it all through doing her homework and going to bed. It kept her antsy during school the next day, too. The only thing that managed to catch her attention for longer than a few minutes was the history teacher reminding them to get their permission slips for the upcoming field trip signed. A few members of the class hadn't turned theirs in yet, and the trip was happening this Friday. She passed out extra slips to everyone in the class in case they'd lost theirs. They were going to visit a former asylum. It had been opened in 1846, closed in 1972, and repurposed by the local historical society about a decade ago. Most of the old rooms had been preserved or recreated for educational purposes. Jane had been once, and the place had given her the willies. She almost hadn't brought up the trip to her parents, but they'd gotten an email a couple of weeks back and cornered her into talking about it. There had been an argument, and her parents had won. She'd turned in the slip and was making plans to fake sickness on the day of the trip. Spending a day at home catching up on homework and reading sounded like a much better time than hanging around a place haunted by the ghost of its former patients and learning about electroshock therapy. Sam noticed her agitation before math class started. "Hey, you good? Feeling better?" she asked. Jane nodded. "Yeah, the headache's gone. Just dealing with some personal stuff." "Want to talk about it?" "Not really." Sam looked about to pry, but the period started and the teacher began talking. Saved by the bell. The rest of the day was tough. Jane spent most of her time distracted and fidgety. Sam kept shooting her concerned glances. When the bell rang to signal the end of the period, she headed straight for the library. PE was only every other day, and she was going to use study hall to make progress in her mystery. If it distracted her from the baseless anxiety clinging to her, so much the better. Queries, kudos, or concerns? Like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening.